Okay, welcome back. We're continuing the lecture by now studying cartel and particularly focusing on the case of a duopoly. It's easiest to study the implications of oligopoly in just a very simple example. And the simplest type of oligopoly is a duopoly. So a duopoly is there's just two firms. And so we'll do this example, two firms, and I'm going to think of the airline industry, and the two airlines I'm going to name Always Late Air, with the acronym ALA, and its competitor is Lose Your Bags Air. So in this simple example, we'll suppose that they each have one plane, and they're just competing on service between Los Angeles, airline code is LAX, and Las Vegas. And so they have the planes, that's already there, and they're just going to decide on the number of rows of seats to put on the plane. The rows are going to come in batches of 6 seats. So given that the plane already exists, and let's just assume that it's already full of gas, so they're just deciding on how many seats to sell on that plane, the marginal cost of an additional row of 6 seats is 0. Okay, so in my example, I'm just going to make assumptions and say, here's what the table for the demand for seats between Los Angeles and Las Vegas. So here on in the table, in the column marked quantity, I have these are in rows of seats. So quantity is 6 seats, so that's 1 row. Quantity of 12, that's 2 rows. 18 is 3 rows, and so on. And so at prices ranging from 0 to 400, you see that at a very high price of 400, nobody wants to fly to Las Vegas. At a price of 0, then everybody wants to fly to Las Vegas. And so we have a nice downward sloping demand curve. And then all the way on the right column that's total revenue. And so total revenue is just multiplying price times quantity. So of course, at a quantity of 0, a price of 400, that's a revenue of 0. But a price of 360, selling 1 row or 6 seats, would yield a revenue of 3,600. And so on. And so compute each of the revenues for each of the quantities and prices. And so you should be able to do that on your own. But in this case, we've sort of assumed that the costs are 0. So the total revenue is also the profit from extra seats here. And so if we recognize that that right-hand column is also the profit, then we can sort of figure out what are the outcomes under the different market structures. So in perfect competition, we know the firms are price takers. And so what they would do is they would produce where price is equal to marginal cost. And here, marginal cost is 0. So the perfect competition outcome would be at a quantity of 60, which is a price of 0, and it leads to 0 profits, just like we would have expected from what we learned about perfect competition. And so that's the green row there. That would be the perfect competition outcome for this market. Okay, now suppose instead of perfect competition, there was a monopoly. So what's the monopolist going to do? The monopolist is going to maximize their profits, taking that demand as given. And so where are those profits maximized? They're maximized at a quantity of 30, and a price of 200 leads to profits of 6,000. So that's the highest profits here, and that would be the monopoly outcome, the row that's in a red typeface. Okay, well, now in our duopoly example, we have these two firms, and what would the firms like to do if it were up to them is they would form a cartel and say, well, let's just, collectively act as if we were monopolists. So if we both just agree that the quantity we're going to produce is 30, we're going to sell our seats at 200, then the total revenue that gets split between them is 6,000. That's the best possible outcome for them. So that's what an oligopolist or these duopolists would do, is that they would get together, they would talk about it and say, well, what we're going to do is we're just going to collude and act as if we're monopolists. And then the market outcome would be the same as if the market was a monopoly. Okay, the only problem with this is that cartels almost always collapse. So cartel is asking these two firms to get together, cooperate, because it's in their mutual best interest to do so. They're better off if they can both agree to behave as if they're monopolists. The problem is, it is often not individually rational for one of these oligopolistic firms to cooperate. It's better to cheat on the agreement. So let's continue with this example. So we have ALA and LURBA decide to form a cartel. So they're going to try and replicate the monopoly outcome. So they agree that the total number of seats that should be sold are 30 and that they're going to sell them at $200 a seat. And then to be fair, they decide, well, we're just going to split it evenly. So ALL will sell 15 seats and LURBA will sell another 15 seats. Then they're just splitting those $6,000 in profits. ALA gets $3,000 and LURBA gets $3,000. And so Friday night, they get together in some back alley somewhere and they decide this is what they're going to do. They're going to sell seats at $200 and they're only going to sell 15 each. And that's an agreement. And then they go back to their offices happy about the agreement that they reached. But then the executives at LA sit back and go, okay, so we agreed that we're going to sell 15 seats. You know, but maybe this guy can't really see what's happening. And so what happens if I cheat, instead sell 21 seats? So 6 more seats than were agreed upon. Well, if ALA went out and sold 6 more seats, then the total quantity of seats that get sold isn't 30 anymore, it's 36. And so at a quantity of 36, we go back and we can look at the demand curve. So at a quantity of 30, they sell for $200, but at a quantity of 36, the price that the firms will get for selling it is going to be $160. So ALA says, okay, fine. I'm going to cheat. I'm going to sell those 21. I recognize that I'm not going to get $200 a seat anymore. I'm going to get $160. But what would my profits be in this situation? Well, now my profits are going to be, okay, I'm selling 21 seats, so more seats, but I'm selling at a lower price, $160. But in aggregate, that makes my profits $3,360, which is more than what ALA is getting under the cartel agreement. So the chief executive of ALA says, okay, yep, I'm cheating. The problem becomes, well, not only is it the ALA executive who went back to the offices, sat back and went through this thought experiment, the executive of LURBA did the same thing. And so the executive of LURBA also recognized that they could produce 21 and earn these higher profits. And so they're going to cheat on the agreement also. And so then they both flood the market. And so they're both producing 6 more than they agreed. So in total, they produced 12 more. So the market quantity becomes 42 seats. From the demand curve, 42 seats goes for a price of $120. And so now each of them is selling 21 seats, so more seats, but at even a lower price, $120, that leads to profits of $2,520 each. So they're worse off from this agreement. But because there was this incentive to cheat, that agreement wasn't individually rational and it wasn't sustainable. And that's why, for this reason, we as economists say, cartels almost always collapse. There's this incentive for the members of the cartel to cheat on it, and they all cheat, and then the agreement collapses, and it collapses to something that's worse off for the firms. Of course, it's better off for consumers because they're getting a higher quantity, a lower price. They're getting closer to that perfect competition, efficient outcome. So this is a general principle that extends beyond just this example. And so the cartel is just collectively trying to replicate the monopoly outcome. But since it's not individually rational to cooperate, each of the firms are going to defect from the agreement. And since they all think this way, the cartel is just going to collapse, and each firm is going to earn lower profits than they would have otherwise. However, this competition isn't driving them to perfect competition necessarily. So because there's only a few firms, they're still exerting some market power and earning positive profits. Well, the sustainability of a cartel does depend on the number of firms. So in this example, we just had 2 firms, and it turns out that 2 firms is easier to sustain than more than 2 firms. Many firms, very difficult to sustain a cartel agreement. And the logic comes from thinking back about that example. So when ALA was thinking about cheating, there were really 2 offsetting effects from cheating. There was what we could call an output effect, which is, well, the price at which they're selling these seats was above the marginal cost. So by selling more, it's increasing their profit. But there was this secondary offsetting effect that we could call the price effect, which was by selling more, they were impacting the price on each unit. And so by selling more, lowering price, that tends to put a downward pressure on profit. The optimal firm behavior would balance these 2. But we can sort of logically think about it and say, well, what happens as the number of firms increases? Well, as the number of firms increases, then the total quantity being sold becomes larger and larger. And so as one firm decides to sell 1 extra seat, 1 more of the good than what was in the agreement, then the price impact of that one producer is smaller as they're a smaller fraction of the total market. So as the number of firms increase, we expect this secondary price effect to become smaller. And so as the number of firms increase, that output effect starts to dominate. Well, it's the output effect which is the incentive to cheat by the firms. So as the number of firms increases, then their incentive to deviate from the cartel agreement becomes stronger, and so it's harder to sustain the cartel. Each firm has an incentive to increase output because the impact of their prices becomes small. So I think a great example of this is what's been happening to oil and gas prices beginning in the second half of 2014 to right in the beginning of 2015. So what was seen was that world oil prices fell in half, basically. And so one of the reasons that people cite for that is there's been all this new U.S. oil production. It's really North American production. So in Canada, in areas like North Dakota, and even parts of Texas, new technologies have allowed them to be able to drill in areas they weren't able to drill before. So they call this fracking. And so before, when there was all this new U.S. oil production, most of the world oil production was coming from countries that were members of something called OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And so this was a cartel. The largest member of that cartel is Saudi Arabia. And the cartel, historically, since the 1970s, have jointly decided on how much to produce of oil, how many barrels to bring to the market. And then what happened was recently, over the last few years, and then really came to head 2014, 2015, was that all this new U.S. oil production was like an increase in the number of firms in this oil market. And so as you had this increase in the number of firms, and especially these firms weren't members of OPEC to begin with, and so they weren't a part of these cartel agreements, it became harder to sustain the cartel. And Saudi Arabia eventually relinquished on the cartel agreements and increased their production to match. And so what we've seen is that the oil market has looked like a much more competitive market than it did before. And that accounts for a lot of the decrease in the oil prices.